Thanks for joining us today. I'm Michelle McLean with Salt Security, and I'm really happy to be joined by Mike Rothman, Chief Strategy Officer at the Techstrong Group, and Nick Rago, Field CTO for us here at Salt Security. And fair warning, I've known Mike Rothman a long time. It's really hard for me to say Mike, so I might slip into Rothman periodically. Forgive me if I do. We're going to kick things off with this discussion just by digging into understanding a little bit about what's happening in your own environment, so that Rothman and Nick have a sense of where is this group? Where are you guys in your journey? Because we can sort of tailor some of the things we're saying based on that. So we're going to do 3 quick questions, just like 10 seconds each, and then move into the results so we can all take a quick snapshot of those, and then we'll dive right in. So for the first one, just looking to understand from an API journey process. Sometimes people start with APIs and they don't have a gateway. So just looking to understand and level set on that. Do you have a gateway? Simple question. We'll close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then, do you have anything on your way toward an API security journey? So sometimes it's simply the gateway and the capabilities there. Sometimes people, of course, have had WAFs for a while, but you have a few other options. You can share some of the ways that you might be securing your APIs today. All right, we'll close the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And our last one. Are you doing anything for API discovery or API inventory? All right, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So let's take a quick peek at the results. Okay, so lots of folks have a gateway, more than half. Very small don't, and a few
don't know.
Evaluating. Okay, and a few don't know. Yeah, that's fairly typical. It's not a surprise. People on the security side are often a bit disconnected from what's happening on the API development side, and that's one of the it's one of the standard challenges for getting a handle on this. Ooh, lots of stuff going on here. So controlling through the gateway or the WAF, some schema validations, coding, authentication and authorization, critical ingredient. We would argue probably not quite enough, but critical ingredient. So that's helpful to see. And last, how are you inventorying? No process, manual with swaggerns, etc. Network scanning, API management. Okay, guys, I think this was actually pretty interesting. Yeah.
Very
excellent. Okay, Tiff, do you want to put us back on just the main entrance screen, and we'll take it from there? Excellent. Thank you so much. All righty. So just starting off to sort of set the stage, we were talking about this in some of our prep meetings. APIs have been around a long time, decades, and it's kind of curious why API is such a big deal now. So maybe just share some quick thoughts, Rothman and Nick, on why you think it's such a hot topic these days.
Well, from my standpoint, yes, Michelle, you're absolutely right. We have had APIs for a long time, but I think we have a different type of application architecture now that are really API centric, whether it's microservices or, kind of integrating, kind of PaaS services and other third-party capabilities into our applications that are accessible via an API, that have both mushroomed the number of APIs we have to deal with, but also put much more critical and sensitive data accessible via these APIs. So it's not that we weren't integrating things before, we were, right? But it wasn't as kind of high wire act that we're on now. And I think folks have finally started to realize, and sometimes we realize things the hard way. I don't know, I didn't want to be the first to mention T-Mobile, but T-Mobile,
So quick, you did it so quick.
We were taking bets on how long it would take for that to come up.
Because we made a bet about how long it was going to take one of us to get there, and I was intent on winning that bet.
Yeah, you were just too competitive.
Very competitive. But I mean, back to your question, Michelle, right? I mean, I think we're in a different environment, a different level of complexity, and that requires a different level of both visibility as well as, kind of analysis on these API activities and traffic therein, just to make sure we understand what's happening there. Because, again, that's one of the path of least resistance for organizations to really get busted nowadays.
Yeah, and Mike, I agree with you. I think from my standpoint, if you take a look at maybe a little bit of the history of APIs, Salesforce in 2000, I think eBay introduced their first API in 2000 as well. These are APIs that were behind monoliths, very specific purpose APIs. There was one doorway we could guard. We could guard the castle with the moat and the one entryway that we're sort of stacking our defenses up against. But API first has, from my standpoint, changed everything. I've been involved with a lot of digital transformation and app modernization projects, really all over North America. And one of the big concerns for a lot of organizations is the fact that a lot of things, when we talk about sort of microservice today and all these APIs that are making up these digital supply chains, these are functions that used to be code that was enabled as functions before, right? They were all part of functions that were embedded inside, some larger application. What did we do at API first design? We've sort of taken all of these, what was functions that were hidden from public view, and we've sort of exposed them. All of that logic glued together as microservices and put that out there for everybody. And I think the other major concern with a lot of organizations right now with APIs has been, it's just not the single castle with the moat and the entryway that we're defending anymore, right? These digital supply chains and these applications and functions are built with multiple development teams using multiple different technologies across multiple different clouds, right? So my surface area and what I have to defend is much more difficult. And Michelle, to answer your question and why API security, the realization for a lot of organizations is that when we start to take a look at, what these breaches are that we're seeing and we peel them back, I know, Mike, you and I have talked before about that. It's not very sophisticated, the attack types that we're seeing today and what the attackers are doing. And so everyone's taking a step back and saying, well, why? Like, what is it we're doing wrong? Why is it so easy to get to this data?
I'd like to say that there's some space aliens that are out there and they're using, kind of attacks from 2029 to get into, your environment, and there's nothing you really could have done. And, honestly, there are some environments where that is the case, that you're facing an adversary that is just, again, kind of sophisticated and advanced to a degree that, there isn't a lot you're going to do to be able to stop it. But the reality is most of it is the analogy I used in a post I did on Techstrong, Security Boulevard, last week is, folks are like pissed off that they leave the door open and somebody comes in and loots their house. It's like, come on, folks. I mean, you leave the door open. Yeah, it's a shame, and people are breaking the law, and it's not the right thing to do. But you leave your door open, right? I mean, so you're not protecting yourself with some of these basic capabilities, again, many of which were on that poll, right? I mean, I thought it was interesting that a lot of them had, over 50%, adoption. Or at least, the folks that are here, which may be a little bit of a self-selecting audience, but we're not going to, kind of get into that, quite yet. But again, I think that it isn't that sophisticated, and I think that most folks just don't bother to fix it until, it's too late.
And what you just said is sort of daunting, right? In the fact that, like I mentioned before, it was the castle, it was the one entryway before. The analogy and pictures I've used with customers in the past have been, we've moved from that castle to showing a picture of a football stadium, right? Yes, it seems so obvious that we left the door open, but did you even know that you had 10,000 different ways to get into the stadium, right? And that's been a lot of struggle for a lot of organizations, just how,
I don't know. And you guys see the movie Everything, Everywhere, All at Once? That's what it kind of feels like, right? I mean, you're in kind of this weird application multiverse, and you have all these things happening all at the same time, and there are so many different pathways in and pathways out, and you change one thing and it ripple effects to everything else, and again, so that's kind of what you're up against. So good luck to all you people out there. Have fun with that.
It is a lot, and I think the simplicity is a little daunting mentally. Our head of research, who's been a white hat hacker for like 30 years, he's like, you used to have to be really smart about how things worked and how did memory work in systems and trigger a buffer overflow. And it was like hard. He's like, this is not hard. So let's take a minute and maybe talk about that aspect, that actually the attacks themselves are changing. That when you're going after an API specifically, you've got specific things to try. So maybe twofold, if you guys can each touch on this, a little bit about the nature of the attacks themselves, and maybe just a minute on why APIs make such an attractive target. You know, I think the simplicity is one aspect of it and the high functionality is one aspect of it, but talk a little bit about those two dimensions.
Yeah, maybe Mike, if cool, I'll go first of what I'm seeing from a breach standpoint. I think the patterns that we're seeing when we take a look at it, a lot of times we put things in terms of the OWASP API top 10, but if we kind of take a step back a little bit, Michelle, and break it down a little bit more, when we take a look at the breaches that we're seeing today, they fall into really 4 categories of, and sort of tactics that API attackers or adversaries are looking at today. The first that we see a lot, that, Optus was a great example of this, and sort of the breach there was this lack of API visibility and governance. Attackers are one of the first things they're looking to do is trying to take advantage of the chaos. The fact that you don't know where all those doors are. You don't know where everything is. You don't know what data types these APIs are handling, and you don't have standardization across the board in terms of how you're dealing with authentication, authorization, what's behind the gateway, what's not behind the gateway. That chaos they're taking advantage of. So we see, attackers looking for the low-hanging fruit, and then we see the breaches like Optus. How did they not know there was an API out there with no authentication, authorization in place that was handling this data? How did Peloton think it was a great idea to have their bikes phone home on an unauthenticated API that was sending back or leaking PII back or personal data back out of those? So that's one of the first avenues. The other avenues that we're seeing a lot with the breaches have to do with just bad security design. Right, this whole idea of misusing or abusing, and I'll let you comment on the term abuse here, Mike, in a second, with APIs. We're seeing this a lot, right? The developer built the API the way that it was supposed to be developed. I've been in a ton of transformation projects where these developers are told, listen, the architect's saying, you have 90 days to develop these 10 microservices. They're all part of this critical business function or digital supply chain. Go. They are doing what they need to do to make that work. In a lot of cases, they're doing it not thinking of, while they're developing these key little pieces of, ingredients to the, part of the recipe, is how can an attacker misuse what I'm doing to basically leverage some type of abuse or misuse pattern. So we saw that with the InfraGard example where, someone got in and they were using an API that was feeding an AJAX utility that, folks part of the FBI InfraGard program can communicate with and look each other up, not thinking that API could be used to harvest information if someone got access to it. The other thing that we see a lot, and that's why we kind of equate it to number 1 on the OWASP API top 10 broken object level authorization, is related to, busted business logic. And that's to the point I mentioned before. We've sort of were able to hide functions behind, the application doorway before. Now these functions are living as microservices. So every endpoint has business logic associated with it, and they are ripe with all sorts of business logic flaw. And we've seen that from reports recently on how, car manufacturers were susceptible to someone getting a VIN number, walking up to your car and starting it and opening the doors. We've seen it with, Facebook, Experian, Coinbase, you name the breach at this point. A lot of them have to do with broken business logic. And the last one that we typically see a lot today, which is more in the news, more and more, Mike, right now, is social engineering attacks are getting really good, right? So we're seeing this sort of notion of, I'm going to get access to a privileged API, and I'm going to do these spear phishing attacks or social engineering attacks for looking at specific people to get access to APIs that I shouldn't have access to, right? Attackers sometimes they'll go to mobile applications and reverse engineer them and try to see, hey, is there something hanging here? Did somebody leave a privileged API key unencrypted in a manifest? Or, can I trick someone to click a link and get an API key or access to a GitHub repository? So we've seen Dropbox, Slack, Circle CI recently in some of the, the social engineering breaches there. So, from my standpoint, Mike, everything sort of breaks down to sort of those 4 categories. Again, layer in all the OWASP API top 10, but that's where people are getting hit right now.
They are. And I think and back to your question, Michelle, I think that this has become much more top of mind, not just due to, you let Nick talk for a minute and he reels off 15 different, kind of situations and breaches that have happened. Our virtual encyclopedia of API breaches over there, which is great. But, it gets back to the path of least resistance, right? And listen, if you're going to go after a web application, here's what you're going to face, right? You're going to have some level of authentication up at the, the CDN level. You're going to have to deal with SSL to, kind of break that in order to try to get access to it. You're going to be fighting some kind of bot thing. There's a WAF in there. And again, none of these things are foolproof, but they're there. Right. And then, you kind of look at a bunch of these other APIs and they got nothing. If they have anything, it's not very sophisticated, just doing some, kind of protocol checking, kind of like, again, think about it. Do I want to fight, kind of my adversaries in 2023, or would I rather fight them in 2010? Right. Using 2023 capabilities. And I'll take that fight any day of the week. Right? I'm not that strong. I'm not that smart. I'm not that strong. I just know if I've got better tooling and I can fight some dude from 13 years ago, I'm pretty likely to win that battle. Right? And that's kind of what we're facing. And that's why you see so much activity around APIs, because folks don't know where they are. They don't have proper protections there. They don't know how to manage them. And they don't know how to detect it when something happens, where a lot of the other capabilities we've got. So our pals, big gaming company Riot Games, they had a big problem with their source code and this stuff. Their SOC caught it in 36 hours, right? You're usually hearing about folks that are, kind of present within an environment for months or years before anybody detects it. 36 hours. That's pretty incredible from that standpoint, because they're looking at all that stuff. I don't know that they're looking, and I'm not Riot anyway, but I know a lot of organizations are not looking at, kind of the API traffic. They're not trying to, kind of use analytics to figure out what is normal traffic patterns and identify what could be anomalous activity there. They're not looking for, again, weird traffic against the back end, that's coming from that API. So shockingly enough, they don't really know when they get popped.
Well, and to be fair, you can't really ask humans to sit there and comb through all this crap. You need something that's going to pop it up and surface it. And all those 2010 defenses you talked about, which we're proud of and we still need, it's not like they don't have a purpose. They do, because if you took that stuff away, you'd get slaughtered by the 2010 attacks. So, you'd still, it's an and, not an or. But, those things simply can't see these kinds of attacks, right? The mechanism is different. The attack form is different. And so your WAF isn't going to see it. Your gateway's not going to see it. And you didn't do anything wrong. You didn't miss something. It's just the world's changed under your feet, and you have to be aware of that. So let's dig into, what do we do now? Like, how do people start to build out a more holistic API security strategy? And, where do you think are some of the great ways or great spots to think about in terms of how to start implementing that strategy?
Yeah, first step is always discovery, right? Because you don't know what you don't know until you know it. So, not having a systematic, and whether it's running through all your API traffic through a gateway, I don't care, right? I'm not religious about, kind of the approach. What you have to have is the ability to look at, kind of your external attack surface and understand what, kind of APIs are there, and basically what kind of authentication/authorization do you have around those APIs. And until you do that, and even if you have perfect protection on 80% of your APIs, you got 20% that's less so, and guess what? They're going to find the path of least resistance. So, kind of a full boat, ongoing, I don't want to say continuous, I hate that term, right? But ongoing discovery process is absolutely critical to any kind of API defense strategy.
Yeah, this has been a big problem. This whole idea, you hear the term API sprawl coming up over and over and over again, that organizations are having trouble keeping their arms around what are our APIs that are out there, not only just the external facing APIs, but what are the internal, what are the internal APIs? And then that piece is sort of becoming more and more of an issue, because when we, I know from just dealing with, customers that we talk to and organizations that we deal with, a large portion of the APIs that they're even deploying and they're using aren't even APIs that they're writing, right? So they're third-party APIs. They're product of low code and no code. They're, we saw F5 and Fortinet put out, alerts that, hey, by the way, our admin APIs interfaces and our appliances, they're susceptible to these type of breaches and attacks. They're vulnerable. So that's another big piece of it, is what not just the things that I'm developing, but what other APIs am I relying on in my supply chains or in my infrastructure management that an attacker, an adversary can be used? What's exposed to the outside, what's internal as well. So I agree, Mike, the sprawl is a huge, huge issue that organizations have to get their arms around. For me, it's twofold. It's discovery. I need to know what's there today. In parallel, I need to come up with a plan to get in front of it, from developer education and spec-first development, right? You don't, big advocate of spec-first development I am over here, right? I just don't believe in building the house without a blueprint. APIs are the same way. Don't build the API until you have a blueprint in place where you've sort of spec'd it out. That way it gives you a chance to document and know what you have. So two parallel efforts I think are important for API sprawl. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Mike.
I would, and I'd also throw in, kind of the necessity of being able to aggregate telemetry from all of these APIs, right? So who's doing it? Who's communicating to it? What kind of traffic is there? How often? There are about a zillion things you can collect for, just don't be a basic API gateway, right? So we're not talking about doing something that is, foreign. But I've got to have the data in order to build the patterns, understand the profiles, and then look for things that kind of don't fall into normal. And again, we're not talking about sophisticated, kind of big data analytics. We're talking about pretty straightforward anomaly detection, because we're doing nothing today. So if you do a little bit, you're a little bit ahead of the game. So is it going to be comprehensive? No. Right. I mean, I think, Nick, you were onto something. We've got to train our developers and our security champions more effectively to understand, how to protect these things. But we can't depend on that. So we've got to know where they are. We've got to understand how they work. We've got to look for patterns relative to, kind of when things don't fit into a normal category. And we have to have some kind of ability to enforce and or remediate these issues, because it's great to know you're under attack. It's even better to stop it and not have to have the forensicators come in and try to pick up the pieces after everything's on the floor. So it is kind of a multifaceted aspect to that. But if you got to start somewhere, start with discovery and then start trying to figure out how you're going to aggregate this data to build some of those patterns there.
When I'm talking to a lot of organizations and they're asking the question, where do I start? The first thing I say is, don't believe the hype. There's a lot. Everybody has API security in their brochureware right now. Every analyst is talking about it. Every vendor, a WAF vendor, WAP vendor, testing, SaaS, DAS vendor is all saying, we got you covered from an API security. Or that we have vendors out there that are saying, we do everything. We're, one-stop shop for API security. And I think we've all been around this long enough where you need sort of master disciplines, right? There's a lot involved from, from best-in-class testing to runtime protection to identity management to API gateway. Not one vendor's doing everything. So that's the first thing I always tell a lot of folks is just be cognizant of, sort of don't believe the hype. You have to pick the solution that works best for you. The other thing is, when I work with a lot of organizations, is making them understand there's your long-term goals and your plan for sort of your API security strategy, development, spec-first development, education of your developers, those type of things. But for a lot of organizations, to your point, Mike, what's sort of the state of the boat right now? Where are we leaking, right? And so for a lot of organizations, API security is really sort of, if I take a look at the life cycle, it's been a right to left sort of problem. What do I need to address right now? I need to know what's out there, what's being used, how it's being used, what data is being handled. But I also need to go above and beyond the blocking and tackling of the known bads of my WAF. To your point, Mike, I need to know when my APIs are under reconnaissance. Am I leaking? Am I leaking data somewhere somehow? Am I under some sophisticated slow, a low and slow type of attack today? And that's where people are getting hit. And when I talk to a lot of attackers, the white hats out there or the bug bounty folks, they're saying, listen, we're taking advantage of the sprawl. We're taking advantage of the fact that we know most organizations are using tools that don't have the context to watch me or capture me in a sea of requests when I'm doing reconnaissance. I'm pretty confident. T-Mobile is a great example, 40 somewhat days without being captured. Facebook had an attack over 18 months with all the telemetry and anomaly detection that they do. But they only were able to capture the attacker when he turned it up just slightly, where then it showed up as a blip on the radar. So that's been the big piece of it. Is I always tell folks, the other thing is, when I take a look at the testing technology that they're using in place, the SaaS, the DAS, again, all very important. I'm big proponent of all of it. But when it comes to API misuse and business logic flaw, there is no magic testing technology, no matter what what vendors are saying today, that is going to flush out all of your business logic flaw. They may be able to capture some of it, but at the end of the day, you're not capturing all of your business logic permutation. So one of the big things that I preach is you have to assume that in production, there are business logic flaws and potential for abuse of your APIs and misuse of your APIs. And so to me, that's a big piece there, is sort of start there, plug the boat, and then we'll figure out how to actually, do the add-ons to the boat to make it better and larger, over time.
Yeah, and to use a little bit of a different analogy, I would, kind of do the whole, crawl, walk, run concept.
And by the way, I don't own a boat, so I'm kind of speaking a little bit wildly here.
Well, I did crawl at one point, and depending on how much I drank, maybe I'd crawl again. But so the whole crawl, walk, run concept. And again, I think from one standpoint, they did a disservice to the unique characteristics of API attacks by just conflating it with WAF into this new, kind of WAP category. But then on the other hand, kind of like, well, if somebody's doing something and they're looking, even if it's a cursory look, that you're routing the traffic through some place and, you actually are starting to interpret, something along the API stuff, that's not a bad thing. It's not enough, right? So necessary, but not sufficient from that standpoint. But it is a start. So I kind of make the analogy that it's kind of like when PCI 6.6 came out like 1,000 years ago and, kind of mandated the use of a WAF in front of an application, right? And folks are like, oh, I got a WAF, I'm good. Well, no, you have to scan the thing. You have to do that. You have to, the developers, as Nick, you said, you have to understand the business logic, issues. So again, yes, you do need to front end these things with something, but no, it's not enough given the kinds of attacks that we're seeing and really just the complexity of your infrastructure. So again, our pals in Stanford did not do everybody a favor by just conflating these two things without, some context to say, yeah, you want to take, the bottom 50% of attacks that are going to be on your APIs. Those boxes are great, just like they do with WAF, but it is not enough in order to give you comprehensive coverage on that.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say, Mike, and I'm going to disagree with something you said a little bit earlier, and that was regarding this whole idea of sort of anomaly detection. And one of the big reasons why a lot of the WAF and WAP vendors have stayed away from this is anomaly detectors are noise machines, right? More often than not, most anomalies are benign, right? And yes, there's some type, they are anomalies. Are they not anomalies? Gartner put out their a report in October saying, hey, runtime protection is important. You got to be prepared that this is going to really hurt your SOC. Look for a managed SOC service or really understand how this is going to impact because of the amount of, possibly false positive, anomalies that are come from it. From my standpoint, this is sort of another discipline where you need mastery. This isn't easy. It is very, again, just because of what we do from a technology standpoint, I know what's involved to discern user intent. It is very, very difficult. Just like, ChatGPT is much different than, some of the other chatbots that you're using with Verizon and T-Mobile when you talk to customer success, customer support out there. It is, there are differences in sort of ML, AI, and being able to have the horsepower to, and the right algorithms in place to really discern user intent. And that's a sort of a mastery and a difference between anomaly detection technology that's going to take down your SOC or something that you're going to have be able to on day one have value and have faith in. So from my standpoint, that's where I think I differ a little bit, is that because I just know what's involved to kind of be able to have that mastery to discern user intent.
Well, I think that's another great buyer beware tip, right? Because buzzword bingo is prevalent. Every vendor's playing it. So
everyone's
you hear the
everyone's
same, yeah, you hear the same terms over and over again. Okay, I want to be mindful of the audience this time. We're kind of at the hour. There was one audience question that I wanted to touch on. It has to do with the traffic patterns that you were talking about. This person saying, so it sounds like, in the old world, I worried a lot more about north-south, and now I need to think about north-south and east-west kind of all at the same time in an API world. I think it's a nice summation in some ways when you're thinking about the strategy here. What do you guys, how would you respond?
I think a couple things. I think is one is exactly right. North-south is your biggest risk, from what's external facing right now. And a lot of folks will stay there. But if you believe in sort of zero trust principles, you also have to understand what's happening east-west. I can't assume, if something is sort of behind the wall, that it can't be misused, abused. I have to know it's there, and I have to have protections in place. So a lot of the stuff that we're doing isn't just discovery on what's external facing. Here at SALT, we're also doing discovery and protections on everything that's running, say, in a Kubernetes cluster. I want to know what all those APIs are, because those APIs aren't just for facilitating one business process. They're being used over and over again. And just because it's internal today doesn't mean that API is not going to find the light of the day. We've seen that over and over again. This is a great API for me to use in a business process that I'm now exposing to the outside world.
Yes. Yeah, I think the answer is an anomaly detection. That's the answer to everything. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. The one thing that I would mention to that, the thing I would also, focus on is to really understand, kind of the usage characteristics of the specific APIs to understand where your attack surface is, right? So that's back to threat modeling, something that we tend not to take the time to do, but would be pretty helpful in terms of understanding what kind of defenses you need in front of, within, kind of all over the place. So, without understanding, I mean, in aggregate, if the question is in the aggregate, well, yes, you have to handle, and worry about, kind of internal APIs as well, because that's kind of how a lot of our applications are weaved together nowadays. But, I think a little dollop of threat modeling when you're building out any of these, kind of systems will really help you understand what kind of protections make the most sense. But that also infers that, kind of security has some visibility into the architecture, right? It has some visibility into design. And I don't really want to, kind of peel back the onion there, because that kind of uncovers a lot of organizational dysfunction that gets in our way. But, I want to throw in a little, tip for threat modeling, because that does, aside from all the fancy whiz bang tech that we can bring to bear, kind of some humans looking at, kind of attack surface before stuff gets built can save you a lot of heartburn in the long run.
Yeah, that's fair. That's great. All right. Well, we promised this audience a quick dive in. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. You were a little quiet today, so next time we want you to pipe up a little more, guys. Huge thanks to Rothman and to Nick for joining us today. Fun conversation, quick moving. We'd love to, if anybody's interested in hearing more, this is not about SALT. This discussion was not about SALT, but if you are interested, you can click the pink Take Survey icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can contact us that way if you want to learn a little bit more about how we think about API security and holistic API security. We'll send out a link to this recording shortly. And once again, Rothman, Nick, thank you so much for a great conversation, and to all of you for sharing a little bit of your valuable time with us today. Hope everybody has a great day. Thank you.